Good morning, guys. So today we are going to talk about trendiness. Let's get into it. Now, trendiness is a broad topic, so we're going to focus on trendiness when it comes to tooling. And this is going out to one of my old colleagues who said the best quote I've ever, well, not the best quote, but it's up there on the top list. He said that the problem with front-end people is that they mistake change for progress. And let's examine that for a moment. Now, I've long argued that the biggest and most important rule that there is in software development is that you need to keep things simple. Keep things simple, stupid. It trumps all other practices. Now, you know, the dry principle, solid, like all of these different programming paradigms that you see out there in the world, they're designed to basically bring simplicity to a project. The issue is, in my opinion, or rather, I think that's actually very funny. This is especially true in JavaScript land, so I'm going to focus on that. But what I find interesting is that rule, whenever I say that you need to keep things simple to people, they all nod and say, yeah, Frederick, you're absolutely right, we should keep things simple. Whenever I say that, usually the discussion is in the context of the code. In other words, people are agreeing that, you know, it's probably good to keep the code simple. But what about the dependencies? What about the tooling that you're using? What about all these fancy different methods of working and so forth? Because what I find interesting is that a lot of people seem to not consider that at all. Now, I'll give you a few examples. Stop me if you've heard of any of these ones. Ember, Aurelia, React, Preact, Angular, Prototype.js, jQuery. And the list just goes on. Meteor.js. And the list goes on and on and on. We have, for solving the same type of problem, we have a really big range of tools that will do that. All these frameworks and all these solutions. And then let's talk about Ajax libraries. We have tons of those as well. And rendering libraries, we have tons of those as well. Server language, server frameworks. JavaScript is probably one of the, it's probably the technology that has the biggest range of tooling there is. And that is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. It's great that you have all these choices, but it's also bad that you have all these choices. And what's even worse is that we live in a world where, for some reason, I don't know why this is, I haven't really seen it in the more conservative languages. Maybe it's because the range of choices isn't all as wide, but what I see is that a lot of front-end developers and so forth, they will just pick something. They will just, or rather they will just adopt things without really thinking about the consequences of adopting that thing. Now, what I mean, I'll give you a great example. When I was working at my previous job, we had this issue where the code base had switched hands a few times. When I got it in like third generation or something like that. And I was walking through the dependencies. We had Axios, and we had Super Agent, and we had jQuery in 3 different parts of the code base handling Ajax requests. Now, let's not even talk about using jQuery only, literally only, to do Ajax calls, but that's beside the point. We had 3 different approaches to solving the same problem, and this is the problem I want to touch on. Because we have this trend or tendency to just adopt new tools and just throw them in there because they're trendy and they're, you know, it's so easy to add them in, right? We start adding things without thinking it through. And this is I really dislike this because it has a few problems with it. The first problem is that you get into an entropy of the libraries that you have. Basically, you have so many different tools that do different things that you need, and now you need to support them. Now you need to support them. And if you think about it, that's not a really fun position to be in. It wasn't all that long ago, like thousands of NPM packages or thousands of JavaScript basically projects broke because there was an NPM package that was removed. And you know what they did? This great, amazing, magical package that brought all this value to the project, it padded log outputs. That's all it did. It's literally like it was a great tech talk where he walked through the function, where he showed what the code actually did. And it's such a silly little thing, but it illustrates a point, I think. And the point is that we have a great diversity in our choice of tooling, but we have we lack the critical thinking. We lack that thing in the back of our heads, or rather a lot of people do, where they start to think, do I really need this, before they actually adopt something. That is completely lacking. And I think it's a big problem, because especially it creates this really big dependency, or rather this idea that there is no risk or there is no problem with adding things into the tech stack. And the thing is that a lot of these tools that you add to your tech stack, you think of it as just adding something in, but you don't see that there's a cost to doing so. I'll give you another great example of this. We basically had, at my current company, we have a framework, a tool that allows us to do grid layouts. Seems reasonable enough. Somebody wanted to create grids, and now we have CSS grids. And because we have this old framework, now we have this issue where literally, if we wanted to do layouts, we have to maintain this project. This dependency is now a hard requirement for our project, and this is the way we do things. We can't transition from it. We're tied into that tool. And if you really ask yourself, and I asked the guy who added this in, did you really need this? Was it really critical for you to do grid layouts? Because I don't see why you need this React component that does basically does the same thing that you do with Flexbox. And Flexbox has been around for longer than this library has. And he said, no, I just kind of wanted to try it out. He just wanted to try it out for a production environment. So he's added in a dependency that is not going, that literally the only reason he did so was because, hey, it was cool. He just wanted to use it. That is not a professional, in my opinion, that's not professional behavior. That is not okay. I'm not judging, because I've done this too. I've worked with people who are even worse. I used to have a colleague, I love that guy to death, but he had a very similar approach, and that's actually why my colleague Mark said these words there. And they are so true, because I see it all the time. There are more dependencies added to a JavaScript project and front-end projects like in general than I've seen in any other tech stack. And I'm here to warn you that just because something's trendy doesn't mean that it brings you more value. I'll give you a good rule of thumb to adhere to, because trust me, if you're adding all these tiny little nothing libraries into your tech stack, all you're going to do is that you're going to get a really small piece of value, and you buy that with bigger entropy in your tech stack. And it also means that a lot of people need to now, you need to inform other people, and you need to support it long term, because as I said in the grids example, I now can't really, I have to make it a political discussion for the whole company. Should we use the damn CSS standard instead of this library? And that problem only exists because somebody decided, without even thinking it through, added a dependency to something that is now literally doing the same thing as we have already been doing. Or rather, the thing, it does the same thing as CSS grid, but CSS grid is a standard. So now do you see, like, now there's a problem. We can't just switch it, because we're already depending on this other thing, which causes all kinds of other issues. So here's my rule of thumb. Use the 80-20 rule. usually you're going to find that 20% of the stuff that you use is going to give you 80% of the value. My general suggestion to you is to think about it this way. Is this thing I'm adding to my tech stack going to help me be more productive long term? And is it going to save me a lot of time? Because if you're just adding something in that, in theory you could build yourself in a very short amount of time, or it's not going to add all that much more value, then no, don't add it in. If it's not something, I'll give you, for example, test runners. I do not have the time and skills needed to build something like Jest or Mocha. That's a good dependency. It's a well-supported framework. I don't have, there's so much, it would take me so much time to build it. React, Angular, Aurelia, Ember, all these big frameworks, they are also a good dependency if you know what you're doing, if you know what you're going to use them for. They are not a good dependency if you're building a static web page, because then you're adding a framework which has a lot of complexity and a lot of weight to an application that doesn't actually need it. I actually argue that a lot of people don't understand that the idea of a framework, at least by my definition, is that if you have an extremely complicated liquid UI that is an SPA, basically, if you have a really complicated UI, then you use a framework because you trade the weight and all the complexity that comes with using something like React for the ability to have a blueprint to structure your project, because that structure is going to help you long term, because it used to be the case that it was very difficult to maintain a large JavaScript project. And that's my mindset, and that's my thought process when I think about these things. So I urge you to do something very similar, because if you're just adding things in because they're trendy, then your thought process isn't elaborate enough, and you really need to start thinking about the long term of your project.